At first glance, the Harper family seemed like any other, a quiet house on a peaceful street, filled with the simple joys of sibling laughter and bedtime stories. But beneath that familiar warmth, life had been quietly unraveling ever since the loss of Emma and Noah's mother. Their father, Jason, had done everything he could to keep their world intact, but life has a way of testing even the strongest hearts. When Noah falls mysteriously ill, Jason's desperation to save his son pushes him to make a decision that changes everything. In the dead of night, a single phone call from Emma brings police sirens to their doorstep and sets off a chain of events that shatters their family in ways no one could have imagined. Emma, only 11 years old, is thrust into a storm of uncertainty, torn between her loyalty to her father, her fear for her brother, and her hope that they can somehow find their way back to the life they once knew. With Noah sent away for experimental treatment and Jason facing the consequences of his actions, Emma must navigate a world full of questions she is too young to answer. But through unexpected kindness, letters that carry the weight of love and regret, and the quiet resilience of a young girl determined to hold her family together, a glimmer of hope begins to emerge. What drove Jason to such desperate lengths? Can Noah recover from the shadows of his illness? And will Emma find the strength to forgive and be forgiven? The wind roared down the quiet streets of Willow Creek, rattling shutters and sending dry leaves skittering across the pavement. Inside a small, worn two-story house at the end of Linden Street, 10-year-old Emma Thompson lay awake, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. The November cold seeped through the thin windows, making her pull the frayed quilt tighter around her shoulders. It was another night without sleep, though she could not explain why. Her father, Mike Thompson, had tucked her in like he always did, his voice warm but tired. His routine had become more hurried lately, and his eyes, once soft and reassuring, now carried shadows that Emma could not quite understand. Since her mother passed away 2 years ago, Mike had done his best to hold the family together. But he seemed different lately, distant, frayed at the edges. Downstairs, a dim light filtered up from under the door of the basement. Emma hated that door. It was always closed, as though trying to hide something. Her older brother Noah lived down there now. He had moved into the basement after their mom died, retreating from the rest of the house and from Emma. At 13, Noah had become someone Emma barely recognized. He was pale, thin, and always tired, missing school for weeks at a time. He barely spoke anymore. Emma turned over, trying to will herself to sleep, when it happened to scream so raw it felt like it ripped the air apart. Emma froze. The sound came from the basement, Noah's voice, full of pain and terror. She clutched her quilt, heart pounding, waiting to hear her dad's voice, his steady reassurance telling Noah everything was fine. But there was only silence. Emma slid out of bed, her bare feet pressing against the cold floorboards. She tiptoed to her door and peeked down the hallway. The soft nightlight in the bathroom cast a weak glow, painting the walls with shadows. She swallowed hard. "Dad?" she called out, her voice small. "Noah?" No response. The quiet pressed in around her. Her heart told her not to go down those stairs. She was just a kid, what could she do? But Noah was her brother. She remembered when he used to play superheroes with her in the backyard, or make silly paper airplanes to chase around the living room. She could not leave him alone. Something was terribly wrong. Emma's eyes darted to the living room, where the phone rested on the side table. Her mother had taught her what to do in an emergency before she passed. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the handset and dialed 911. A calm voice answered, "911, what is your emergency?" Emma clutched the phone tightly. "My brother," he screamed, "he's in the basement, and my dad, he's not answering." The dispatcher's voice softened. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Thompson." "Okay, Emma, help is on the way. Can you stay on the line with me?" Emma nodded before realizing they could not see her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. She glanced toward the basement door. The shadows felt heavier now, like something terrible was hiding just beyond the threshold. The dispatcher kept talking, asking her questions to keep her calm. Emma tried to focus, but her mind kept filling with images of Noah hurt, Noah trapped, and her dad unable to help. She heard the distant wail of sirens getting closer. Red and blue lights flashed outside, painting the walls in shifting colors. There was a sharp knock at the door. Emma placed the phone down carefully and rushed to let the police in. The officers entered swiftly but gently. A tall officer with kind eyes knelt in front of her. "Emma, I'm Officer Reynolds. We're here to help." She pointed toward the basement, her hand trembling. "Down there." Reynolds exchanged a look with his partner before moving toward the door. Another officer stayed with Emma, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She could hear their footsteps on the wooden stairs, slow and cautious. The sound of a door opening wider sent a shiver down her spine. Then came the shouting voices commanding someone to stop, a frantic scramble of movement. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, willing it all to be over. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular. "Please let Noah be okay." Moments later, she saw the officers carrying Noah up the stairs, his arms and legs bound by thick ropes. His face was pale and tear-streaked, and his breathing was shallow. He looked fragile, like he might break apart. Behind them, her father was led up in handcuffs. His face was streaked with sweat, his eyes wild with fear. "I was trying to help him," he cried. "You don't understand. He's sick. He needs this." Emma's heart cracked open. This man, the one in handcuffs, looked like her dad, but also did not. He was desperate, frantic, pleading with the officers who did not seem to listen. Emma wanted to run to him, to ask what had happened, but she was frozen in place. As the paramedics loaded Noah onto a gurney, Emma watched helplessly. She searched for any sign of recognition in his eyes, but he remained limp. She reached out, wanting to call his name, but her voice caught in her throat. Her father's voice rose again. "Check his medication. I was trying to save him." But no one listened. An officer gently guided Emma outside. The cold air bit at her skin, and she wrapped the blanket tighter around her. She watched as the ambulance doors closed, its red lights spinning in the dark. Noah was gone. Her father was placed in the back of a squad car. He turned to look at her, his eyes full of something that might have been regret or love, or maybe both. He mouthed something she could not hear. The squad car pulled away, taking him with it. Emma stood on the edge of the lawn, the night's events pressing down on her small shoulders. The dispatcher's words from the phone still echoed in her ears. "You did the right thing." But all Emma could feel was the weight of everything that had gone wrong. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as the world around her spun into an uncertain blur. A kind voice broke through. "We'll take you somewhere safe," Officer Reynolds said softly. Emma nodded, too tired to resist. She stepped into the waiting car, the blanket still draped over her shoulders, and pressed her forehead to the window. As they drove away from the only home she had ever known, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. "Noah, I'll make sure you're okay. I'll make sure we both are." The police car hummed quietly as it drove through the empty streets of Willow Creek. Emma sat curled in the back seat, staring at the familiar houses slipping past each window, glowing softly with warmth, each porch light steady and comforting, but not hers. Her house felt like it had become something else entirely, hollow and full of shadows. The officer driving, Officer Reynolds, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You're doing really well, Emma," he said, his voice gentle. "We're taking you to a safe place for tonight. There'll be people there who can help." Emma didn't answer. She didn't trust herself to speak. Her throat felt tight, and her chest ached with confusion and fear. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Noah's pale face, the ropes biting into his wrists, and her father's panicked cries. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, whispering in her mind, "I don't understand. Why did he tie Noah up? Why did he act like that? He's not a bad person." The car slowed as they pulled into a building with warm, low lights and a small, welcoming entrance. A sign outside read, "Willow Creek Family Services Center." Officer Reynolds parked and stepped out, opening her door carefully. Emma hesitated, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Come on," he said softly. "It's okay." Emma slid out of the car and took his hand. The building smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla when they stepped inside, but it felt strange and unfamiliar. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and curly brown hair hurried toward them. "Hello, Emma," she said, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "I'm Linda Walker. I work here at the Family Services Center. You're safe now." She offered a small, warm smile. "Would you like something to drink? Maybe hot chocolate?" Emma nodded slowly. Her stomach was in knots, but her fingers felt cold, and she liked the idea of holding something warm. Linda guided her to a small couch in a cozy room with soft lamps and a stack of books on a side table. A few minutes later, Linda returned with a mug of hot chocolate, steam curling from the top. Emma wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her palms. Linda sat across from her. "I know this must be really hard," she said gently, "but you're not alone. Do you want to talk about what happened tonight?" Emma stared down at the chocolate, watching the tiny marshmallows swirl in the mug. She shook her head. "That's okay," Linda said. "You can talk whenever you're ready. There's no rush." Emma's gaze lifted slightly. Is Noah okay?" Her voice was small, fragile. Linda's smile dimmed just a little, but her tone remained calm. "Noah is with the doctors now. They're doing everything they can to help him." Emma nodded, though it wasn't the answer she wanted. She took a small sip from the mug, letting the sweet warmth settle on her tongue. "Your dad. He's going to talk to the police," Linda continued gently. "They're trying to figure everything out. For now, though, you're going to stay somewhere safe." Emma blinked at her. Am I going to live with someone else?" Linda hesitated, as though she wanted to shield Emma from the full truth. "Just for a little while," she said. "A nice family nearby. They're good people. They've helped other kids before. You'll have a warm bed and good meals." Emma looked down at the blanket draped over her shoulders. It was scratchy, but she hugged it tighter. "What about Noah? Can I see him?" Linda softened her tone. "Not yet, but soon, once he's feeling better." A lump rose in Emma's throat again, and she fought to keep the tears from spilling over. She didn't want to cry in front of Linda or anyone else. She didn't want to seem weak. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soft and familiar from long ago. "You're braver than you think, Emma." She swallowed hard. "Okay," she whispered. Linda reached out and gently touched Emma's shoulder. "You're being really brave." The words felt hollow at first, but Emma held on to them, trying to believe they were true. The Browns' house was only a few streets away from Emma's own, though it felt like a different world. The porch light glowed warmly, and the house had a small garden out front, where faded flowers still clung to life despite the cold. Mrs. Brown opened the door, bundled in a thick sweater and smiling softly. "Hi there, Emma," she said kindly. "Come on in, sweetheart." Emma stepped inside, her heart thudding. The house smelled like cinnamon and something sweet baking in the oven. Mr. Brown appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "You must be starving," he said, his voice gentle but cheerful. "We've got some cookies fresh out of the oven. Oatmeal chocolate chip. They're my specialty." Emma didn't feel hungry, but she nodded politely. Mrs. Brown led her to the living room and handed her a plate with a cookie, still warm and soft. She took a small bite. It tasted like something from another life, a life where her mother made cookies with her on Saturdays, and Noah laughed as he pretended to be a cookie thief. She blinked back more tears. The Browns didn't ask her questions or press her to talk. They simply made her feel safe. For the first time that night, Emma's shoulders relaxed a little. Upstairs, Mrs. Brown showed Emma the guest room. There was a twin bed covered with a soft quilt, a small desk with colored pencils, and glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling, just like in her own room. Emma brushed her fingertips over one of the stars, feeling a pang of homesickness. "Thank you," she murmured. Mrs. Brown nodded. "We're glad you're here, Emma. You're safe now." Emma sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long, shaky breath as Mrs. Brown left, closing the door gently behind her. The room was quiet, but not in the same way as the basement had been. It was a quiet that felt soft, not heavy. She lay down, pulling the quilt over herself. Her mind was still tangled with questions about Noah, about her dad, about what would happen next. But as she closed her eyes, the memory of the Browns' kindness lingered. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was still room for hope. Emma whispered one last thought before sleep finally came. Please let Noah be okay. The next morning, soft sunlight streamed through the guest room window, bathing the small space in a pale glow. Emma blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar room. The quilt felt warm and heavy, a comfort she hadn't expected. She lay still, listening to the faint hum of the housebirds chirping outside, the low murmur of Mr. and Mrs. Brown talking downstairs. Her first thought was Noah. Was he awake? Was he okay? Her heart twisted at the memory of his pale face and the ropes around his wrists. She pushed the image away and sat up, rubbing her eyes. A knock at the door made her flinch. "Emma, sweetheart," Mrs. Brown's soft voice called through the door. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are." Emma hesitated before answering. "Okay." She stood, smoothed out the quilt, and walked to the dresser, where a pile of neatly folded clothes had been placed: a soft sweater, jeans, and wool socks. They weren't hers, but they looked warm. After getting dressed, she made her way downstairs. The Browns' kitchen was cozy and bright, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of pancakes filling the air. Mr. Brown stood at the stove, flipping a golden pancake with practiced ease. Mrs. Brown sat at the table with a mug of coffee, her glasses perched on her nose as she read the newspaper. "Morning, Emma," Mr. Brown greeted her with a warm smile. "Hungry?" Emma's stomach grumbled in reply, surprising her. She hadn't realized how empty it felt. She nodded shyly and slid into the chair across from Mrs. Brown. Mr. Brown placed a plate in front of her with 2 pancakes topped with syrup and a sprinkle of powdered sugar. "These are the best pancakes in Willow Creek," he said with a wink. Emma took a small bite. The pancake was light, sweet, and buttery. She chewed slowly, trying to savor it, but her mind kept wandering back to Noah. Mrs. Brown must have noticed the cloud in Emma's eyes. She set down her mug and leaned forward slightly. "Emma," she said gently, "I know this is hard, but the doctors are taking good care of your brother. He's in the best hands." Emma swallowed her bite and looked down at her plate. He didn't look okay," she whispered. Mrs. Brown reached across the table and gave Emma's hand a gentle squeeze. "I know," she said softly, "but you did the right thing by calling for help. You were brave." The word brave felt strange, like it didn't belong to her. She hadn't felt brave, just scared and small. But she nodded anyway, not wanting to argue. After breakfast, Mrs. Brown suggested they take a walk around the neighborhood. "A little fresh air might do you some good," she said with a smile. Emma hesitated but agreed. She didn't want to sit in silence, trapped with her worries. The neighborhood was quiet as they walked down the tree-lined street. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at winter. Mrs. Brown pointed out the different houses, telling Emma who lived where. "That's the Andersons' place," she said, nodding toward a house with a bright red door. "Their dog, Max, loves chasing squirrels." Emma listened quietly, her hands tucked into her sweater pockets. They passed a house with a group of kids playing in the yard. They were bundled up in coats and scarves, their laughter ringing out as they kicked a soccer ball around. Emma's chest tightened. She used to play like that with Noah. He'd been the best at making up games and making her laugh. Mrs. Brown seemed to notice her silence. "I know this must feel like the longest day," she said softly, "but things will get better." Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. When they returned to the house, a familiar figure was waiting on the porch. Linda Walker, the social worker from the night before. She was holding a manila folder and gave Emma a kind smile. "Hi, Emma," Linda said as they approached. Emma's pulse quickened. Is this about Noah?" Linda nodded. "Can we sit inside and talk?" Emma followed Linda and Mrs. Brown into the living room. They all sat down on the couch. Linda opened the folder and glanced at the papers inside before meeting Emma's gaze. "Noah is stable," she said, her voice calm. "The doctors say he's responding to the medication, but they're running more tests to understand what's causing the seizures." Emma felt her shoulders sag with relief, but fear still clung to her. "So, he's not getting worse?" Linda smiled gently. "No. And the good news is that he's awake. He's asking for you." Emma's heart fluttered. "Can I see him?" Linda hesitated. "Not today, but soon. They want to make sure he's strong enough for visitors. But I promise, you'll see him very soon." Emma nodded, holding on to the hope those words brought. Linda shifted slightly. "There's something else, Emma. Your dad. He's being held at the station right now. He's talking to the police about everything that happened. They're trying to figure out why he did what he did." Emma's throat tightened. She thought of her dad's face as he was led out in handcuffs, the way he had called out, "I was trying to help him." It didn't make sense. Her dad was not a bad person. He had always tried his best for them. Linda placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "I know this is a lot, but you don't have to figure everything out alone, okay? You've got a lot of people who care about you." Emma swallowed hard and nodded. What's going to happen to him?" Linda's expression softened. "That's up to the court, but they'll take everything into account, especially how much he loves you and Noah. Right now, they just want to understand." Emma let the words settle. She wanted to believe that people would understand her dad, that they would see the man who stayed up late to fix her bike when the chain broke, or who sang off-key lullabies to make her laugh. Mrs. Brown stood and brought over a glass of water, placing it in front of Emma. "Whenever you need to talk, we're here," she said gently. Emma took a sip, her fingers still trembling slightly. She didn't know how long it would take for things to make sense again, or if they ever truly would. But Linda's words replayed in her mind. "You're not alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, the idea of hope didn't feel so far away. The rest of the day felt like a slow blur. After Linda left, Emma sat on the living room couch, staring at the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains. She tried to focus on the soft hum of life around her, the ticking clock, the faint bubbling sound of the Browns' old coffee pot, but her mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why had her dad done it? Was Noah really going to be okay? When would she see him again? Mrs. Brown moved quietly around the house, giving Emma space while still making her feel cared for. She brought over a plate of apple slices and a glass of lemonade without saying a word, as though she understood that Emma couldn't handle more right now. Emma nibbled at a slice of apple, tasting nothing. The day felt impossibly long, and every hour dragged like a heavy weight. By evening, Mrs. Brown suggested they watch a movie together. She picked an animated one that Emma recognized, an old favorite about a boy and his sister navigating a magical forest. Emma nodded quietly and settled onto the couch. Halfway through the movie, she felt something strange. Not quite comfort, but a sense that maybe, just for a moment, she didn't have to feel so afraid. The Browns weren't trying to distract her with cheerful talk or overwhelm her with questions. They just sat with her, offering their presence like a steady anchor in a storm. When the movie ended, Mrs. Brown looked over and gave Emma a gentle smile. Do you want to help me bake some cookies before bed? Emma blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected the offer, but something about the idea felt normal, and right now, normal felt like something precious and rare. She nodded. In the kitchen, Mrs. Brown pulled out flour, sugar, and chocolate chips while Emma washed her hands at the sink. The warm light from the ceiling lamp cast a soft glow over the countertops. Mrs. Brown handed Emma a wooden spoon and smiled. "You'll be in charge of stirring," she said. Emma scooped flour into the bowl and stirred as the soft powder mixed with butter and sugar. The repetitive motion felt calming, a small reminder of the days when she and her mom would bake together on Sunday afternoons. The memory hit her like a sudden wave, her mom, laughing as flour dusted her nose, Noah sneaking chocolate chips when he thought no one was looking. Emma felt a sharp ache in her chest but pushed it aside, focusing on the dough in front of her. When the cookies went into the oven, the kitchen filled with the rich, sweet smell of chocolate. Mrs. Brown wiped her hands on a dish towel and looked down at Emma. "I know you're carrying a lot right now," she said gently. "But you don't have to carry it all by yourself." Emma swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words. She wanted to believe her, but it was hard. So much of her life had shifted overnight, and she still felt like she was standing on uneven ground. Later that night, Emma lay in bed under the soft quilt. The room was quiet, except for the faint chirping of crickets outside the window. She closed her eyes, trying to drift into sleep, but the quiet gave space for her fears to rise. What if Noah isn't okay? What if they never let Dad come home? She turned onto her side and hugged her pillow, whispering the same silent plea she had whispered so many times that day. "Please, let things be okay." The next morning, Linda returned. Emma felt a flicker of nervousness as she sat on the couch while Linda took a seat across from her. There was something in Linda's expression, gentle but serious, that made Emma brace herself. "Emma," Linda began carefully, "I know you've been really strong through all of this, and I wanted to update you about your dad." Emma's heart thudded. Is he in trouble?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. The police are still trying to figure everything out, but your dad is facing charges because of what happened." Emma felt her chest tighten. She had expected it, but hearing the words out loud made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. "But," Linda continued, "the police also know your dad isn't a bad person. They've seen how much he loves you and Noah. That's important." Emma's fingers twisted in her lap. "He didn't mean to hurt Noah," she whispered. Linda nodded. "I believe you, and I believe he believed he was trying to help. But sometimes, when grown-ups get scared or desperate, they make decisions that aren't safe." Emma thought of the fear in her dad's eyes that night. She thought of his voice, breaking as he cried out, "You don't understand, he's sick." She looked at Linda with wide, worried eyes. "Is Noah really sick?" Linda's face softened. "The doctors are still figuring that out, but Noah's getting the care he needs now, and they're hopeful. You'll get to see him soon." Emma nodded slowly, though the answer only filled her with more questions. Later that afternoon, Emma sat at the small desk in the guest room, looking at a blank sheet of paper. Mrs. Brown had told her that writing letters could help when feelings became too heavy. Emma wasn't sure it would work, but she picked up a pen and began to write. "Dear Noah, I miss you. The house I'm staying at is nice. The Browns are kind and they bake cookies, but I still wish I was home. I've been thinking about you a lot. I don't really understand what's happening, but I hope you know I'm here. And I hope you're getting better. When you're back, maybe we can play superheroes again. I'll let you pick first this time. I hope you're okay. Love, Emma." She stared at the letter for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it on the desk. She didn't know if Noah would ever see it, but writing it felt like a small, quiet step toward something better. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, she remembered the way Linda had said, "You're not alone," and in her dreams, She imagined Noah waking up and smiling at her, telling her everything would be okay. The world still felt full of questions and fears, but somewhere inside that fear was a fragile thread of hope, a thread Emma wasn't ready to let go of. The days passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. Emma clung to small routines to fill the endless hours, helping Mrs. Brown in the kitchen, reading on the couch, taking quiet walks around the neighborhood. But no matter how kind the Browns were, or how warm the house felt, she couldn't shake the ache in her chest. Every time the phone rang, she held her breath, hoping it was news about Noah. Every time Linda stopped by, Emma sat on the edge of her seat, waiting for the words she longed to hear. Finally, the day came. Linda arrived in the early afternoon, wearing her usual calm expression, but with a softness in her eyes that made Emma's heart leap. "Emma?" Linda said, kneeling so they were at eye level. "The doctors say Noah is well enough for a short visit. If you're ready, we can go see him." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "I can see Noah," she whispered, her eyes wide. Linda nodded with a gentle smile. "Yes." Emma scrambled to grab her jacket, barely able to contain the rush of emotions, relief, fear, excitement. Mrs. Brown helped her zip up the front and handed her a small notebook and pen. "In case you want to write anything down," Mrs. Brown said softly. Emma nodded, clutching the notebook tightly as she followed Linda out to the car. The ride to the hospital felt both endless and far too short. Emma watched the familiar streets blur past, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of the notebook. She thought about what she would say to Noah, but every time she tried to form the words, they got tangled in her mind. Linda pulled into the hospital parking lot and led Emma inside. The scent of antiseptic and the faint hum of overhead lights made Emma's stomach churn. The walls were painted pale blue, but it wasn't enough to make the space feel less cold. As they reached the pediatric wing, a nurse greeted them with a warm smile. "You must be Emma," she said kindly. "Noah's been asking about you." Emma's heart swelled at the thought that Noah wanted to see her just as much as she wanted to see him. The nurse led them to a private room at the end of the hall. Emma hesitated outside the door, suddenly afraid of what she might see. The last time she had seen Noah, he had been pale and bound, his face streaked with tears. What if he still looked so small and broken? Linda placed a hand on her shoulder. "Take your time," she said gently. Emma took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and stepped inside. Noah lay on a hospital bed, propped up by pillows. His face was still pale, and dark circles lingered under his eyes, but he was awake. His brown curls fell messily over his forehead, and when he saw Emma, a small, tired smile spread across his face. "Hey, Em," he whispered, his voice raspy but familiar. Emma's chest tightened as she crossed the room and perched carefully on the edge of the chair beside his bed. "Hi, Noah," she said softly, fighting back tears. Noah's hand lay limp on the blanket, and Emma reached out, gently wrapping her fingers around his. His skin was cool, but the touch was real. He was real. "I missed you," Emma murmured. Noah's smile faltered, and his eyes glistened. "I missed you too." For a moment, they just sat there, holding hands in the quiet room. Emma took in every detail, the soft beep of the monitors, the way the afternoon sunlight filtered through the window, the familiar way Noah's eyes crinkled at the corners when he looked at her. "You scared me," Emma whispered. I thought you were—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Noah's expression softened with guilt. "I'm sorry, Em." His voice cracked. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Emma shook her head. "It's not your fault." Noah hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ceiling. "I don't know. Dad was trying to help me, but I was so scared." He swallowed hard. Everything hurt, and he kept saying it would make me better, but it didn't feel right. Emma's stomach twisted. She had spent days trying to make sense of what had happened in the basement, and hearing Noah's side of it made her heart ache even more. "I don't understand," Emma said quietly. "Why didn't Dad just call the doctors?" Noah looked down at their joined hands. "I don't know. I think he was scared too." The room fell into silence again, thick with questions neither of them could answer. Linda stepped forward, her voice calm and steady. "Noah, the doctors are working really hard to figure out what's going on. And your dad, he's talking to people who want to understand why he did what he did." Noah's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Is he in trouble?" Emma felt her throat tighten again. "Yeah," she whispered. "But Linda says the police know he didn't want to hurt you. They're trying to be fair." Noah's brows furrowed. I don't want to lose him too." Emma's heart ached at the thought. First their mom, and now their dad. The idea of their family being completely torn apart felt unbearable. Linda crouched down beside Noah's bed. "Noah, your dad made some dangerous choices, but he loves you. That hasn't changed. And right now, the most important thing is that you get better." Noah nodded slowly, though his eyes were distant. Emma squeezed his hand tighter, wishing she could erase the fear from his face. After a while, the nurse came in to check Noah's vitals, signaling that the visit was almost over. Emma felt a pang of disappointment, but forced herself to smile. "I'll come back soon," she promised. Noah's smile was faint, but real. "Bring me something better than hospital food next time," he joked, his voice weak but playful. Emma laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. "Deal." She stood, letting her hand linger in his for just a moment longer before stepping away. As she walked back into the hallway with Linda, her heart felt both lighter and heavier. Seeing Noah awake, hearing his voice, it was more than she had dared to hope for, but the shadows of uncertainty still clung to her. On the drive back to the Browns' house, Emma stared out the window, watching the town blur past. Her mind replayed every moment of the visit, Noah's smile, his apology, the way his voice cracked when he mentioned their dad. Linda glanced over at her. "You did really well today, Emma," she said gently. "I know it wasn't easy." Emma nodded. I don't know how to make everything okay." Linda's voice softened. "You can't fix everything on your own. But being there for Noah, showing him you care, that's enough." Emma's fingers brushed over the notebook in her lap. She thought about the letter she had written but never sent. Maybe she didn't have all the answers, but she had one thing she could hold on to: her promise to be there for Noah, no matter what. As the car pulled into the Browns' driveway, Emma whispered under her breath, "We'll figure it out. We have to." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, Linda, herself, or the world, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of strength beneath the fear, and that was enough to keep going. The Browns' house felt quieter when Emma walked through the door. The warm scent of cookies still lingered in the air, and Mrs. Brown greeted her with a soft hug. But despite the comfort around her, Emma couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. She kicked off her shoes and went straight to the couch, curling into the corner with her notebook. She opened it and stared at the letter she had written to Noah a few days ago. It felt strange now, knowing he was awake, that she had seen him smile. She reached for her pen and began a new letter. "Dear Dad, I saw Noah today. He's awake, and he smiled at me, but he's still confused. And so am I. I don't understand why you did what you did. I keep thinking about you in the basement with the ropes and the needle. It didn't look like you. But I remember the good things too. I remember when you helped me fix my bike, and when you made pancakes shaped like stars after Mom died, because you wanted to make me feel better. You've always tried your best. I just don't understand why you didn't call for help sooner. I miss you, Dad. I hope you can explain someday." Emma set the pen down and stared at the words until they blurred. A tear slid down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly. She folded the letter and tucked it into the back of her notebook, unsure if she would ever send it. Later that evening, after dinner, Emma sat at the kitchen table while Mrs. Brown finished washing the dishes. The sound of water running and the clink of plates felt oddly soothing. Mrs. Brown glanced over her shoulder. "Do you want to go for a walk before it gets too dark?" Emma shook her head. "I'm kind of tired." Mrs. Brown nodded, wiping her hands dry. "That's okay." She pulled out a chair and sat across from Emma. Her eyes were kind but serious. "You've been really brave, Emma, but I know this is a lot to carry." Emma swallowed and looked down at the table. "It's like everything is too big," she murmured. "I keep trying to understand, but I can't." Mrs. Brown reached across the table and gently placed her hand over Emma's. "You don't have to understand everything right now. Sometimes it takes time for things to make sense, or at least feel less heavy." Emma's lip quivered. "I just want things to go back to how they were before Noah got sick." Mrs. Brown nodded slowly. "I know, sweetheart, but you and Noah are both stronger than you think." The words sank into Emma's heart, and for a moment she let herself believe they might be true. The next morning, Linda arrived again. Emma was starting to recognize the sound of her knock, gentle but firm, like everything else about her. "Emma, there's something important we need to talk about," Linda said as she sat down in the living room. Emma shifted nervously. "Is it about Dad?" Linda nodded. "Yes. The court is going to decide what happens next. Your dad has agreed to plead guilty to a lesser-charged child endangerment. That means he's admitting that what he did was wrong, but the court is considering his reasons too." Emma's heart sank. "Does that mean he's going to jail?" Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He might not. The judge will decide if he needs to serve time in prison or if he can stay out on probation. Probation means he'd have to follow strict rules, like going to counseling and staying in touch with social workers, but he'd have a chance to be part of your and Noah's lives again, little by little." Emma felt a mix of relief and fear. The idea of seeing her dad again felt both comforting and terrifying. Does Noah know?" Linda nodded. "Yes, we talked to him. He wants to see your dad too, but it'll take time. The court wants to make sure everything is safe." Emma hugged her knees to her chest. "What if the judge doesn't let him come back?" Linda's voice was soft. "No matter what happens, you and Noah will have people who care about you. Your dad made a mistake, but that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. And he's trying to make things right." Emma nodded slowly, though the ache in her chest remained. A few days later, Emma sat in the guest room, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. They reminded her of the ones in her real bedroom, the place that now felt a world away. There was a soft knock at the door. "Emma, honey?" Mrs. Brown stepped inside with a small stack of letters in her hand. "These came for you." Emma sat up, her heart skipping. "Who are they from?" Mrs. Brown handed her the letters, and Emma's breath caught when she saw the familiar handwriting on the envelopes. "They're from your dad," Mrs. Brown said gently, before stepping back to give Emma some privacy. Emma stared at the letters for a long time before opening the first one. "Dear Emma, I know you're scared, and I know you're angry. You have every right to be. I've replayed everything that happened in my mind 100 times, and I wish I could go back and do things differently, but I can't. What I can do is tell you the truth. Noah was in so much pain, and I felt helpless. The doctors told us it would take months to get the treatment he needed. I thought I could make it better on my own, but I made everything worse. I want you to know that I love you and Noah more than anything in the world. I'm trying to fix things. I'm going to counseling, and I'm doing what the court asks me to do. I want to be the dad you need me to be. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope, someday, we can be a family again. Love, Dad." Emma's eyes blurred with tears as she finished reading. She read the letter again and again, letting the words sink in. Her dad's handwriting was shaky in places, as though he had been holding back tears too. For the first time in days, Emma felt something loosen inside her, like a small crack in the wall she had built around her heart. She wasn't ready to forgive him yet, but she could feel the love in his words, and it gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the nightstand. Then she lay back on the bed, staring at the stars on the ceiling. She whispered quietly, "Maybe things can get better." Outside the window, the wind rustled the trees gently, as though agreeing with her. Emma closed her eyes, her dad's words still echoing in her mind. We can be a family again. She wasn't sure what the future would look like, but for the first time, she believed it might not be so far out of reach. The following morning, Emma woke with the strange feeling that something had shifted, not in a big, obvious way, but like the world had shifted half a step closer to something better. Her dad's letter sat on the nightstand, folded neatly. She reached for it, running her fingers over the creases. It wasn't a perfect answer. Nothing was fixed, but it was enough to know he still cared, enough to believe that maybe things could change. Mrs. Brown poked her head into the room with a soft smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," Linda called. "She's coming by after lunch with an update." Emma sat up. "Is it about Noah?" "I think so," Mrs. Brown replied gently. She didn't say much, but she sounded hopeful. Hopeful. Emma clung to that word. She nodded and slid out of bed. "Okay." By the time Linda arrived, Emma was waiting by the living room window. The second she saw Linda's car pull into the driveway, she ran to the front door and opened it before Linda could even knock. Linda smiled warmly. "You beat me to it," she said, stepping inside. Emma felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. "What did the doctors say?" Linda took a seat on the couch and motioned for Emma to sit beside her. "Noah's test results came back," she began. "The doctors have a diagnosis now. He has a rare neurological condition, but the good news is that it's treatable." Emma's heart leapt. Treatable. Does that mean he's going to be okay? Linda's expression softened. "With the right treatment, Noah's symptoms can be managed. There's a clinical trial in Michigan that could make a big difference for him, but it means he'll have to stay there for a while." Emma's excitement dimmed. "In Michigan? That's so far away." Linda nodded. "I know, but this trial could help Noah have a normal life again." She reached for Emma's hand. "And you'll still be able to visit him. We'll make sure of that." Emma looked down at their joined hands, trying to process it all. "Will he have to go soon?" "Yes," Linda said gently. "In just a few days. The doctors don't want to wait too long." Emma bit her lip. She was happy that Noah had a chance to get better, but the thought of him being so far away made her chest ache. "Does he know?" Linda smiled. "Yes. And he told me to tell you that he wants you to visit before he leaves." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I want to see him too." Linda squeezed her hand. "We'll go tomorrow, okay?" Emma nodded, trying to keep the tears at bay. The next day, Emma found herself standing outside Noah's hospital room again. The nurse gave her a reassuring smile before opening the door. Emma stepped inside, clutching her notebook tightly. Noah was sitting up in bed, wearing a soft blue sweatshirt that made him look more like himself. His face was still pale, but there was more life in his eyes. He smiled when he saw her. "Hey, Em," he said. Emma hurried to his side and climbed onto the chair. "Hi, Noah." He reached out, and Emma took his hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emma stared at him, taking in every detail: his crooked smile, the way his hair flopped over his forehead, the slight flush returning to his cheeks. "I heard about Michigan," Emma said quietly. Noah's smile faltered. "Yeah, it's kind of scary," Emma nodded. But it's a good kind of scary, right? Noah's lips tugged into a small grin. Yeah, I guess it is. Emma took a deep breath. I'm going to visit you as much as I can. And when you come back, we can play superheroes again. Noah's eyes sparkled with something close to joy. You still remember that? Emma smiled. Of course. You were always the fastest. Noah chuckled softly. I'll have to practice running again once I get better. You will, Emma said firmly. You'll get better, Noah. They sat in silence for a moment before Noah's voice turned more serious. Do you think Dad's going to be okay? Emma's heart tightened. I don't know, she admitted. But I think he's trying. He sent me a letter. Noah's eyes widened. Really? What did he say? He said he's sorry, Emma replied, and that he's trying to fix things. He told me he loves us. Noah looked down at their joined hands, his expression thoughtful. I believe him, he said quietly. Emma nodded, tears filling her eyes. Me too. When it was time to leave, Emma hugged Noah tightly. She didn't care if the nurse thought she was lingering too long. She wanted Noah to feel how much she loved him. See you soon, Em, Noah whispered. Emma smiled through her tears. See you soon. The drive home felt quieter than before. Emma stared out the window, her mind filled with a mix of hope and sadness. She wanted so badly for things to be normal again. But maybe, she thought, they could build something new, even if it wasn't exactly the same as before. Mrs. Brown was waiting at the door when they arrived. She wrapped Emma in a gentle hug the moment she stepped inside. You did great today, she whispered. Emma hugged her back, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and comfort. That evening, after dinner, Emma sat at the kitchen table and pulled out her notebook. This time, she didn't write a letter. Instead, she began to draw. She sketched herself and Noah standing in their backyard. In the drawing, the sun was shining, and Noah was holding a kite. She imagined it fluttering in the breeze, the way it had during one of their best afternoons together. She smiled softly as she shaded in the sky. It wasn't perfect, but it was a small reminder of everything she hoped for. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Emma thought about Noah in the hospital and their dad writing letters from wherever he was. She thought about Michigan and the long road ahead for all of them. We're not there yet, she thought, but we're getting closer. The stars on the ceiling glowed faintly above her, and for the first time in weeks, she drifted into sleep without fear. Tomorrow would bring more questions, but it would also bring more chances to heal. And as long as she had those chances, Emma knew she could keep moving forward. The road ahead was long, but hope was a steady light, like the stars above her, small but steady, leading her home. The day Noah left for Michigan came faster than Emma expected. She sat by the window in the Browns' living room, watching the rain trickle down the glass like a slow, steady rhythm. Everything felt too quiet. Even the birds seemed to be hiding from the gray sky. Linda had come by earlier to check in, but Emma's heart was somewhere else at the hospital, where Noah was probably packing up, getting ready for the trip that would take him so far away. Mrs. Brown walked into the room, carrying a soft bundle of fabric. I thought this might help, she said gently, handing Emma a small blanket patterned with tiny stars. Emma traced the soft edges with her fingers. It looks like the one I had when I was little. Mrs. Brown smiled. I thought you might like it. She sat down beside Emma and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. It's okay to feel sad, she said quietly. Even when we know someone is going to get better, it's still hard to say goodbye. Emma pressed her cheek against the blanket. I just don't want him to feel like he's alone. Mrs. Brown nodded. He knows you're with him, Emma. You've been his anchor through this whole thing. Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wanted to believe that. That afternoon, Linda called to say Noah's plane had taken off. Emma felt like the air left the room as she listened. He's in the sky now, Linda said, her voice calm and reassuring. This is the next step in getting him better. Emma thanked Linda and hung up the phone before she could cry. She hated crying in front of people, even kind people like Linda and the Browns. She hurried upstairs to the guest room and curled up on the bed, clutching the blanket tightly. "Please let him be okay," she whispered into the quiet. She thought back to their last conversation at the hospital, the way Noah had smiled, tired but hopeful. "You have to be strong, okay?" he had told her. She could still hear his voice. Her hand drifted to the notebook on the bedside table. She pulled it into her lap and opened to the last page. This time, the words came easily. "Dear Noah, I know you're probably somewhere over the clouds by now. I hope you're not scared. I hope the view is beautiful. I bet you can see everything from up there. I miss you already. The house feels empty without you. Even though we weren't home much these last few weeks, I'll be counting down the days until you come back. Be brave. I'll be brave too. We'll both hold on until everything feels normal again. Love, Emma." She closed the notebook and hugged it to her chest. She wondered if Noah could feel her words from wherever he was. The next few days felt strange, like she was walking through someone else's life. School started up again, and the Browns helped her get ready each morning. They packed her lunch and made sure she had clean clothes and her favorite socks with the polka dots. At school, her friends were kind but hesitant. They asked questions she didn't know how to answer. "Is your brother okay? Is your dad in jail?" Emma hated the way the questions made her feel like she was standing in the spotlight, all her pain visible to the world. Instead of explaining, she would shrug and change the subject. But the truth stayed inside her, heavy and silent. One afternoon after school, Mrs. Brown called Emma into the kitchen. There was a soft hum of conversation from the living room, and when Emma stepped into the doorway, she saw Linda sitting at the table. "Hi, Emma," Linda said with a warm smile. Emma's nerves prickled. "Is something wrong?" Linda shook her head. "No, nothing bad. I just have some news." Emma sat across from her, her heart thudding in her chest. "What kind of news?" Linda reached into her bag and pulled out another letter. Emma recognized the handwriting instantly, her dad's. "He wrote to you again," Linda said gently, sliding the envelope across the table. Emma's fingers trembled as she picked it up. She looked up at Linda. "Can I read it alone?" Linda nodded. "Of course." Emma clutched the letter and hurried to the guest room, closing the door softly behind her. She sat on the bed, took a steadying breath, and opened the envelope. "Dear Emma, I hope you know how proud I am of you. You've always been strong, but I never meant for you to have to be this strong. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. The truth is, I was scared, Emma. I was scared of losing Noah. And when I should have reached out for help, I thought I had to handle it all alone. I made the wrong choice, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. But I'm going to counseling, just like I promised. I'm talking to people who understand how things went wrong, and I'm trying to learn how to make things right. I hope you can forgive me someday. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Emma. You and Noah both. I'm holding on to the hope that we'll be together again. Love, Dad." Emma read the letter twice, her heart aching with every word. She didn't know how to feel angry, sad, or relieved. Maybe all of those things at once. She folded the letter and placed it beside the first one on her nightstand. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she felt a tiny shift inside her, like a small weight had been lifted. Her dad was trying. That was enough for now. That evening, after dinner, Mrs. Brown pulled out a box of board games and set it on the coffee table. "Pick one," she said with a playful smile. Emma hesitated, then chose a game she and Noah used to play, a simple card game where the goal was to make the longest train route across the map. Mrs. Brown and Mr. Brown sat on either side of her as they began the game. As the pieces clicked into place on the board, Emma felt a flicker of something warm, a memory of laughter and long afternoons when things had been simpler. The Browns didn't try to replace Noah or her dad. They just made space for her in their lives, filling the quiet moments with kindness. By the time the game ended, Emma's cheeks were pink from smiling. She still missed Noah. She still worried about her dad. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it all alone. When she went to bed that night, she lay under the soft quilt and thought about Noah, miles away in Michigan, and her dad, wherever he was. She whispered into the darkness, "We're going to be okay." The stars on the ceiling glowed softly above her, steady and constant. And for the first time, she believed her own words. The days after Noah's departure felt like a strange, slow drift. Each morning, Emma woke up to the same room, the same breakfast smells, and the same quiet ache in her chest. But little by little, things started to feel less heavy. The Browns kept her busy. Mrs. Brown taught her how to knit, and Mr. Brown helped her build a small birdhouse to hang in the backyard. They never pushed her to talk, but they made space for her when she needed to. Every night, Emma wrote in her notebook letters to Noah, her dad, and sometimes just to herself. The letters felt like a way to speak into the silence, as though she was sending pieces of herself to the people she loved, no matter how far apart they were. One evening, Linda came by after dinner, carrying a folder and wearing a hopeful smile. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her heart fluttering with nerves. "I have some updates," Linda began, as she set the folder down. Emma sat up straighter. "About Noah?" Linda nodded. "Yes, his doctors in Michigan sent a report. He's adjusting well to the treatment, and they're optimistic. He's getting stronger." Emma felt a rush of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. "He's really getting better?" Linda's smile softened. "Yes, Emma. He's making progress." Emma's heart felt like it was expanding in her chest, filling with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Can I talk to him?" Linda nodded. "I was just about to suggest that. The doctors said he's well enough for video calls now." Emma's eyes widened. "A video calls? I'll be able to see him?" Linda reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet. "How about we try right now?" Emma's hands trembled as she took the tablet. Linda helped her set it up, and soon the screen flashed to life. A loading icon spun for a moment. Then Noah's face appeared. "Noah!" Emma burst out, her voice full of joy. Noah smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "Hey, Em." His voice was a little stronger than it had been at the hospital, though still soft. Emma blinked back tears. "You look better." Noah chuckled. "I feel better. Tired, but better." Emma nodded quickly, afraid that if she stopped, she might start crying. "I've missed you so much." "I've missed you too," Noah said, his face serious. "How's school? And the Browns?" Emma shrugged. "School's okay. People ask a lot of questions, but I just try to ignore them." She smiled a little. "The Browns are really nice. They make cookies almost every day." Noah laughed softly. "Save some for me." "I will," Emma promised. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the distance between them bridged by the screen. "You're really brave, Em," Noah said quietly. Emma's throat tightened. "You are too." They talked for a while longer about the little things, the funny birds outside the Browns' house, the games they used to play. For a few minutes it felt like nothing had changed, like they were just two siblings hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. When it was time to end the call, Emma hesitated. "When you come home, do you think things will feel normal again?" Noah's smile was small but hopeful. "I don't know, but maybe they can feel good in a new way." Emma nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe." After the call ended, Emma sat with the tablet in her lap, her heart full of so many emotions she could barely sort them. Seeing Noah smile had been like opening a window. After a long winter, everything felt warmer and brighter. Linda leaned over and smiled. You did great. Emma looked up at her. He really seems okay. Linda nodded. He's getting there. And you're helping, Emma. The next morning, Mrs. Brown handed Emma a letter over breakfast. It came for you this morning, she said with a soft smile. Emma recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from her dad. Her heart thudded as she carefully opened the envelope. Dear Emma, I heard you got to talk to Noah. I can only imagine how happy that made you. I hope you know how proud I am of you. Things are hard right now, but I'm doing what I promised. I'm going to counseling, and I'm trying to learn from what happened. I want to be better for you and Noah, for myself too. The social workers have been visiting me and checking on everything. They told me you've been so brave. I always knew you were. You've always been the strongest part of our family. I know things can't go back to the way they were, but I'm holding on to the hope that they can still be good. I hope that when the time comes, we can talk, really talk. I want to hear everything you've been feeling. I want to make things right. I love you, Emma. Dad. Emma folded the letter slowly, tears welling in her eyes. She thought back to the days when she had felt so lost and angry, unsure if she could ever understand what her dad had done. But now, there was something different. She didn't have all the answers, but she could feel her heart softening. That afternoon, she sat on the back porch with Mrs. Brown, watching the birds flit around the birdhouse they had built together. Mrs. Brown? Emma asked quietly. Yes, sweetheart? Do you think people can really change? Mrs. Brown thought for a moment. I think it's hard for people to change, she said gently. But I also think that when they're willing to work at it, it's possible. Emma nodded slowly. I think my dad's trying. I'm not ready to forgive him completely, but I don't want to be mad forever. Mrs. Brown smiled. That's okay. Forgiveness takes time. You're allowed to feel what you feel. Emma let out a long breath, feeling some of the tension in her chest ease. I think I'm ready to talk to him. Maybe not yet in person, but maybe soon. Mrs. Brown's smile widened. That's a big step, Emma. Emma stared at the sky, imagining Noah in Michigan and her dad sitting somewhere, writing his next letter. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt steady enough to take the next step. We're going to figure this out, she whispered, as much to herself as to the world around her. And in the quiet rustling of the trees, it almost felt like the world whispered back, You will. The day Emma finally spoke to her dad felt like the first step toward something new. It happened on a calm Sunday morning, the kind of morning where the sun filtered softly through the windows and the world seemed to take a breath. Linda arrived early, holding a phone in her hand. It's time, Emma, she said gently. Your dad's ready if you are. Emma's stomach twisted with nerves. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times in her head, but now that the moment was here, all the words felt tangled. She looked over at Mrs. Brown, who gave her a reassuring nod. You don't have to be perfect, Mrs. Brown said softly. Just be honest. Emma took a deep breath, wiped her clammy hands on her jeans, and nodded. Okay? Linda handed her the phone. Emma held it to her ear, her heart pounding. Hi, Emma. Her dad's voice came through the line, quiet but steady, familiar, yet changed. Emma froze for a second, taking in the sound of it. She hadn't heard his voice since that night, and it brought back so many feelings at once: fear, anger, love, sadness. Hi, she whispered. There was a long pause, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like both of them were trying to hold on to something fragile. Her dad was the first to speak. I've missed you. His voice cracked at the end. Emma swallowed hard. I've missed you too. Her dad let out a shaky breath. Emma, I'm so sorry for everything. I should have called for help. I should have done so many things differently. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. You and Noah didn't deserve any of this. Emma's chest felt tight. She had waited so long to hear those words, but now that she had, they didn't erase the pain. Still, they felt real. I was scared, her dad continued, but that's not an excuse. I let my fear control me, and I hurt both of you in ways I never meant to. Emma closed her eyes. I was scared too, she said quietly. I didn't know what was happening. I thought I was going to lose you and Noah at the same time. There was a soft sound on the other end, like her dad was trying not to cry. I know I can't fix everything, he said, but I'm trying to be better. I'm doing everything the court asked me to do: counseling, parenting classes, and I'll keep doing it, no matter how long it takes. I just want to be someone you and Noah can trust again. Emma's fingers tightened around the phone. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet, she admitted. There was no anger in her dad's response, only understanding. That's okay, Emma. You don't have to. I'll wait as long as you need. The honesty in his voice broke something open inside her. The anger she had been holding on to for so long began to feel smaller, less sharp. She wasn't ready to let it all go, but she wasn't holding it as tightly anymore. Do you think we can be a family again? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Her dad's answer was quiet, but firm. I hope so, Emma. I really do. Emma nodded, though he couldn't see it. Me too. There was another pause before her dad asked, How's Noah? Emma smiled softly, thinking of the call with Noah. He's doing better. He's getting stronger. I told him you wrote to me. Her dad's voice softened. I'm glad. I hope. Maybe someday I can write to him too. I think he'd like that, Emma said. For the first time since the call began, Emma felt a flicker of peace. This wasn't the end. It wasn't some magical fix where everything went back to normal. But it was something, a bridge between them that hadn't been there before. I love you, Emma, her dad said. I'll never stop loving you. Emma's throat tightened again. I love you too, Dad. When the call ended, Emma let out a long breath and set the phone down. Mrs. Brown was watching her with quiet kindness. How do you feel? She asked. Emma thought for a moment. Like, I took a step forward. Mrs. Brown smiled. That's what matters. The weeks that followed brought more changes, but this time, they felt like changes Emma could handle. She and Noah had regular video calls, and with every conversation, he looked a little stronger. He told her about the books he was reading, the games he was playing, and the friends he had made in Michigan. One afternoon, he grinned through the screen. Guess what? What? Emma asked, curious. They let me go outside today, Noah said excitedly. I got to walk around the gardens. I felt like I was flying. Emma laughed. You're going to be faster than me when you come home. Maybe, Noah teased. But only if you let me win. Emma shook her head, smiling. Never. The Browns continued to make Emma feel at home, but they also understood that her heart was split between where she was and where she wanted to be. They never tried to replace her family. They just stood beside her, steady and kind. Linda kept visiting, helping Emma prepare for the next steps. The court would review her dad's progress soon, and there was a possibility that he could have supervised visits with Emma and Noah in the coming months. One evening, Emma sat at the kitchen table, finishing her homework when Linda handed her another envelope. This one's from the court, Linda explained. It's about your dad's progress. Emma opened the envelope carefully and read the letter inside. Her heart skipped as she saw the words, approved for supervised visits. He's doing it, Emma whispered. Linda smiled. Yes, he is. The first time Emma saw her dad in person, after everything, it was at a community center, with Linda and another counselor there to make sure it felt safe. He looked different, thinner, quieter, but his smile was the same. Emma took a hesitant step toward him, then another. When he opened his arms, she walked into them, her heart pounding. His hug was warm, careful, and steady. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. Emma didn't speak, she just held on tighter. In the months that followed, the pieces of Emma's world slowly began to knit together again. Noah stayed in Michigan for his treatments, but was finally well enough to visit home during the holidays. Her dad's supervised visits became more regular, and Emma felt her trust in him growing, bit by bit. One snowy afternoon, Emma sat with Noah in the Browns' living room, watching the snowflakes drift past the window. Their dad would be arriving soon for another visit, and Emma felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Noah leaned over and whispered, "I told you we'd be okay." Emma smiled, her heart light. "Yeah, we are." As they waited, the room filled with the warmth of quiet laughter and the smell of fresh cookies baking in the oven. The future wasn't perfect, but it was bright. The journey had been long and painful, but they had made it through kindness, resilience, and the unbreakable threads of love. And for the first time, Emma knew for certain. They were a family, and they always would be. Emma sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly across the yard. Noah was resting on the couch, bundled in a quilt, laughing at one of Mr. Brown's stories. Their dad would be arriving soon, another step forward in a journey that had been anything but easy. But here they were together, growing stronger and learning that healing takes time, but love makes it possible. As Emma watched the peaceful scene unfold, she felt a quiet certainty settle inside her. Things would never be perfect, but they didn't need to be. They had faced the hardest days and found their way back to each other, piece by piece. Noah caught her gaze and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" Emma smiled back, warmth filling her heart. "About how far we've come." Noah nodded, his eyes bright with understanding. "We've still got a long way to go, but we're not alone." "Never," Emma whispered. The world outside was cold and silent, but inside, the house was filled with laughter, love, and the promise of better days ahead. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of kindness and resilience, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of hope, courage, and family. Together, we can keep sharing stories that remind us all. Even in the darkest times, there's always light. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.